Welcome to Mindset U Podcast, your source of mindset education. We aim to provide you with free, valuable education for you to thrive. Enjoy. Today's podcast is 4 of 4. In the other 3, we talked about post-traumatic growth, values, and group values, and how all this can impact the way we view ourselves in the world and the actions that we take. Today, we're going to focus on group conflicts and emotions. I think we just uncovered something, which has to do with kind of defining vulnerability. As you were talking about, when you define the vulnerability as questioning self, right? And I was talking about before where the part of your brain that goes offline, turning that on, consciously making an effort, turning that on is what vulnerability is. Questioning that narrative. If we can think of it as a practical, useful skill that you can derive from this, is the idea that you look at an experience, a story, then question the opposing possibilities, almost like you're arguing against yourself.
I would argue that's thinking.
The interesting part about this is that in another book, they were talking about in relationships, they tried an experiment like that where to help in conflict, they had both partners, like let's say they're arguing about something, and then both partners would write down what their partner's views would be. But what it did actually was it created more anger because they just thought of better ways to combat what their partner would say. Now, if you think of it within yourself and you keep going back and forth, eventually you're going to exhaust yourself with this back and forth argument because I would say this and then I would say this, right? But that's a skill, right? We've talked about that. That's a skill that you need to practice to be able to have that kind of internal dialogue. But when you recognize that you're not building someone outside of you, you're not fighting someone outside of you, you're fighting yourself. That opens up your mind. So that turns on that prefrontal cortex that is logically thinking all possibilities, perspectives, and creating, like Jordan Peterson says, creating that virtual world that you get to test and practice ideas in. And with that, you get to see how it makes sense in the real world. So the more accurate you get with those mental models, the more you can test them in the real world. But that perspective of, hey, can I be wrong? And then you go kind of question that into the real world. Now you're building kind of a repertoire of information when you're challenging yourself, not only back and forth, but then you're looking for evidence. That's essentially change.
That also is the logical thinking part of the thing. Not logical. I don't want to say logical because it's the thinking part of vulnerability. But then I feel like people need to understand what it feels like to be wrong. And like that's why I like the renewed mindset program, right? Like the ability to be vulnerable, to like cry in front of people, right? Like that's what scares everybody from this thing. It's not even the physical stuff, right? It's more like, oh, I'm not sure if I'm ready to open up in front of people. Well, why are you not? Why, like, you don't know these people. What do they like have? Well, the thing is, you're afraid of crying in front of them. You're afraid of exposing yourself in front of them. So like, you're not afraid of telling the story because you told me the story. But what you're afraid of is the reaction of the story that you're going to have when you do tell the story. So it's, again, going back to that, you still haven't truly extinguished the emotions that lie within, right? Like, yeah, that trauma, that story, all of these things, you're going to feel it. But I would think that before you can even get to the part of, I'm looking where to be wrong, you kind of have to know what it feels like to be wrong. You gotta have to kind of deal with those like really uncomfortable emotions. Like, dude, when I got into that argument with you and you basically said I was like a piece of shit, I went hiking. I was all fucked up. I was like, damn, man, I fucked up. I went hiking. I had to really allow myself to internalize that and feel it. And understand what it feels like to be wrong and not run away from it, which is what people do. They find coping mechanisms. And this could be easy. This is watching TV. This could be go scrolling through Instagram or your social media. This could be eating. This could be so many different things that we cope with these, what we would label as negative emotions, quote unquote.
Yeah, we don't believe in positive or negative emotions. But I think it goes with the righteousness of feeling and wanting to be right.
What does that feel like?
Like that's
What
basically,
does feel like being right? What does feeling right feel like?
it's an ego trip, right?
Mm.
You have to slaughter your ego. That's what feeling wrong is.
Yeah, but what does it actually feel? What does feeling wrong actually like physiologically? Like, what are the sensations that people go through? And it can be very different for you and I.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like for me, I could fucking tear up and shit. For you, you might fucking laugh. Like who knows? Like, like physiologically, and I think understanding that, like just the patterns and the behaviors of how you interact with uncomfortable situations, physically, I think people like they try to think their way like or rationalize their way out of these emotions, but until you truly understand it, like you don't know the labels that you really place on them. Like you don't know the labels when what you place on anger if you never really experience anger. Like I fucking love anger. I used to think that shit was bad. I see the value of anger now. But I needed to experience it. Right? Chris Rock talked about it, how he beat the shit out of somebody when he was a kid. And because he did that, he felt like so afraid of expressing that anger that he became a pushover. The interpretation and the narrative he created with that emotion, he blocked himself from ever feeling that again because he never really kind of created the other narratives and the other kind of perspectives with that emotion.
The way I think about it is like it's development. It's like a child developing. We have these physical things that we look for, right? Oh, can the baby crawl now? Is the baby rolling over? Things like that. If we looked at that from the emotional development, I think it would be similar things. Because the baby, in order to be able to roll over, for example, needs to be able to turn his head, needs to be able to reach across his body. Like all these things build into rolling over, into that action. If we were to look at emotional range in that same way, it's like, is the baby crying when you do something that bothers it? Is the baby screaming when you take away the bottle? Does the baby have that range? Now, we look at the physical things, okay, we have the range, roll over, all that stuff. Now, using all those components to teach that toddler how to throw a ball. All those key components that needed to be used to roll over now are duplicated to a higher degree. With emotions, it stopped at that point for babies. So no practice, okay, when you're feeling angry, this is what it means. Instead, we say these are bad emotions. So when you're feeling angry, you need to stop that. You need to be on punishment because this is not acceptable. And we never learn how to move our emotions the way we learn to move our physical bodies.
Yeah, I think we're taught the labels to place on these emotions very quickly, very easily, as those are the labels that the people around us place on it, as a society, as a family, as tribes, whatever the case may be. But I think that's the problem. It's like, okay, so you get anger, right? So anger can be a bad thing, right? If it goes into the deep end, right? A bad thing, quote unquote. But it's really more about the space that you can create between the emotion and your response. It's like the smaller that space is between emotion and your response, now it gets closer to a reaction, which then becomes, I guess, damaging. It can be damaging, right? Like if you're angry and you can't create enough space between anger and your response, then you can probably kill somebody. And that's because you can't control it. You never trained it. You don't know what it feels like to get that angry. So to create that space, you have no idea. So it's first under actualizing the labels that we place on anger. Let's say, for example, remove the label and then allow you to experience the physiological responses of that emotion, what it actually feels like, elevated heart rate. Maybe for me, it's really red in the face, right? Tear, frustration, whatever the case may be. And then allowing yourself to experience that in a safe environment, which I think is the next thing, is like where do most people have a safe environment to do this, to practice this? And that's where the blockage comes.
So now, before we close out, to get specific on this, like you're talking about anger specifically, I mean, this goes for all emotions, but when we're talking about anger and emotional range and the ability to express emotions, I would be remorse if I didn't bring up men. Because unfortunately, this is the reality for most men, where there's no practice, there's no levels for learning and expressing. For us men, we're taught to suppress our emotions, to suppress our sadness, the need to cry, things like this. So we're taught to, as soon as we get insight of this physiology that represents these emotions to shut it down, to ignore it. And when it comes to anger, we're taught that we're either dangerous when we're angry, or we're taught that high levels of anger are okay. But then we go into the world and that's not okay. So you got men that like, okay, I guess I got to suppress this as well. And then now you don't have any practice of expressing your emotional ranges, which doesn't allow you to come full circle when we talk about that original study I talked about with the suicide rates, where you're not connecting with anyone else. How could you, when you don't know yourself, when you don't know your own emotions, how could you connect and integrate yourself with someone else? When you know nothing about this, you can't know anything about anyone else. I think this creates an isolation. Without that connection, that's why men commit suicide in such a high rates. Don't seek help when they need it. I think this is a great opportunity when we talk about the practice of expressing the emotion. We talk about the experiences. For us, the way we see that is through physical activity. We can put ourselves in the space to exhaust our physiology that practices so much in repression. And once that's exhausted, now you're left with the raw field of emotions and who you are and how you are and why you are, and all your thoughts come bubbling up, which then allow you to see yourself for the first time. And when you see yourself, now you can care for yourself. Now you can open up yourself to connect with others. And in that connection, you can learn to have a community, to be open to a community, and basically just live a happier, meaningful, purposeful life.
Preach, brother.
What does your health, love life, spirituality, career, finances all have in common? Your mindset. Mindset is the source of creating change. To learn how to install these and other life-transforming concepts, browse through our free collection of courses at betheproject.com.